Hello and welcome to a new webcast from the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden. My name is Hussein Askari. Today we are going to go to some people here might seem to be a very remote part of the world. We are going to Australia. You see here in the map behind me. We are going to Australia, and people might say, well, what does that have to do with the Belt and Road? And to discuss this question and to demystify this mystery, I would like to welcome Mr. Robert Barwick, the Research Director of the Australian Citizens Party. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you for having me, Hussein. And if it's any consolation, I think you're from a remote part of the world as well.
Yeah, exactly. It depends on which perspective we are talking about. Now, please introduce yourself and your organization to our viewers.
I'm the research director of a political party, the Australian Citizens Party, formerly known as the Citizens Electoral Council, or CEC. We've been a party 35 years in Australia. We're a very established non-major party. We're not in the parliament, but we're very effective in political campaigns we run on policy, especially economic policy, to promote prosperity and a decent future for Australia. And as part of that, we've always had a global outlook, Hussein. We've always recognised that, what's good for Australia or what's good for the world is good for Australia, and what's good for Australia is good for the world. And international cooperation with other nations is very important to achieving that. We believe in the principle of peace through economic development, cooperative economic development. For a long time, our party has had a very constructive, collaborative relationship with the Schiller Institute. As you know, we've met at Schiller Institute conferences in Europe a number of times, which is how you and I have come to know each other. And so as the Schiller Institute, led by Helga LaRouche and the late Lyndon LaRouche, promoted policies from the late 1980s and the 1990s, such as the European Productive Triangle and then the Eurasian land bridge policy, we promoted that very heavily in Australia as a vision for the world that we should be part of. And we have a lot to offer. Australia has immense natural resources, but the Belt and Road, as you know, refers to a belt and a road. And the road part, ironically or paradoxically, is the water-based part. It's the maritime road. And we can certainly see a role for Australia participating in that. And that's how we plan to fit in.
Yeah, I'd see it in your campaign. Maybe I should move to the side so we can have the region you're talking about in perspective. You have distinguished yourself in your campaigns, your literature, by advocating a very strong relationship with China, economic relationship with China, and actively being part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So, but what is the history of Australian-Chinese trade cooperation, and also were there any discussions between Australian governments and China on joining the BRI or collaborating with the BRI?
Well, to be honest, there's a very, very long history of Australia's trading relationship with China going back to pre-European days. There is evidence that Chinese traders traded with Australian Aboriginals long before Europeans arrived. I think there's some evidence that big fleet in 1492 that left China and sailed around the world landed here as well. So there's a history to that in the European settlement era. Like with the United States, we've always had a large Chinese presence in Australia. Chinese labour coming to our gold fields when there were gold rushes, etc. In fact, I'm from a town in rural Victoria that I didn't appreciate until last year, was founded by Chinese gold diggers. And it's actually got it's got a Turkish name, Ararat, named after Mount Ararat in Turkey. But it was founded
where Noah's Ark landed.
Noah's Ark, yeah, that's right. But it was founded by Chinese gold diggers in the gold rush in that era, and now I understand why there's a big Chinese temple there. So there's long been a Chinese presence in Australia. Unfortunately, there's also been a very negative approach to China for a long time. It's been called the Yellow Peril. The European and the British elites were able to play on racial fears going back 150 years that Australia could be invaded by China, which has never happened. It's never going to happen, but it's laid the foundation for a certain prejudice. However, in the latter era, the last few decades, from the 1990s onwards, China's growth has been tied up with Australia's resources, especially our iron ore, which is mainly in Western Australia on the west side there of that map, and our coal. And China has become a greater and greater consumer of both those resources, especially iron ore, which has been very important to its internal economic development, which has been spectacular. And so our growth with China has soared off the charts in the last few decades, to the point where China, for quite a long time now, has been our biggest and most important trading partner by far. And I mean by far. It leaves the others so far behind, it's not funny. And in fact, I've got a chart that I'd like to show you. That is Australia's top 5 trading partners. And here's China. This is all 2020. And the purpose of this particular chart is to show, even in that year, the first pandemic year, the growth in trade in that year. And that was a year of extreme tension with China, but it was so much greater than everybody else, right? Every other country. And this has been something that, the way Australia's economy is structured now, we cannot survive without this trade. Now, I'm critical of that vulnerability. We shouldn't have structured it so much that we can't survive without it. But nevertheless, the trade itself is very good for us. It's very beneficial, and it's massively in our favor. We have a surplus that is something in the order of $75 billion in our favor.
Part of the Belt and Road Initiative, the basic document, it also talks about industrialization. So you will not be only reliant on exporting raw materials to China, but you might start building industries using the same raw materials you're exporting to produce industrial goods or semi-finished goods and so on.
That's how we would see it in the Citizens Party. Unfortunately, our governments in Australia have very little vision. And so they have limited Australia for a long time to just being a raw materials exporter. Yeah. What I'm saying is, even in those limited terms, it's still immensely beneficial for us. If we participated in the Belt and Road, there is a whole breadth of participation that we could have, going way beyond just raw materials, that would be beneficial for us and the whole world. It would actually, I believe, the Belt and Road could be a way that Australia realises its potential to be a food basket for the whole world. We have a lot of untapped potential here, but you need a sense that this potential can be realised, that you're going to have markets for it, etc. The Belt and Road can be a way to achieve that. Yeah. But unfortunately, the discussion on the Belt and Road has become poisoned.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up the question of food production, because we do have a really extreme food crisis in the world, and that's because many nations who can produce food are not producing food. But we can come back to that in terms of what kind of ideas and projects you have in your country. But as I understand, there were some agreements signed concerning the Belt and Road Initiative itself between, I don't know if it's the government or...
it was. Australia signed 2 Belt and Road agreements with China. Now, let me give you the positive side of that first, because when the Belt and Road was first unveiled, our response was incredibly positive. As the country that had the most beneficial trade relationship with China, our government had no hesitation in saying, we want to be part of this. And if I can just share my screen again, I want to play a short video clip from 2017 of our government saying this. This is our trade minister in 2017 when the Belt and Road was announced.
Australia's Trade Minister says China's Belt and Road Initiative will provide a win-win opportunity after attending the summit in Beijing over the last couple of days. Stephen Shobo is heading to Hanoi for the APEC Trade Ministers meeting. He's currently in Hong Kong today and joins us now from there. Minister, great to have you. Of course, win-win is the preferred terminology from Beijing. You've said that you want to see the details of this $78 billion infrastructure push. What are you hoping or expecting that Australia might be able to get out of it?
Well, Australia's got a great track record with the financing, the design, and the construction of infrastructure. I think that there's real opportunity for us to be able to work in a complementary way with this initiative. Australia, of course, has a great relationship with China, especially when it comes to trade. We've got a lot of knowledge and experience that we can share. So I'm very confident that going forward, Australia will be able to play its role as part of the broader initiative being executed across the various countries and throughout Asia and into Europe.
So that was our trade minister at the time in 2017. It was greeted with great enthusiasm. We saw benefits. When I say we, our government saw benefits for Australia straight away, economic opportunities for Australia. So the federal government, the Commonwealth government, signed a Belt and Road agreement with China that related to Australia participating with China in third-party projects. So we would get opportunities, say in Papua New Guinea or in Indonesia or in one of the other Southeast Asian nations, etc., maybe a Pacific Island nation, etc. We had a memorandum of understanding for that. Now, the terms of that have not been made public, but I just know that it happened. There was a second agreement signed by the government of the state I live in, Victoria, and it was a state government agreement with China, a memorandum of understanding of participating in Belt and Road. Now, this became controversial, but before I go too far into that, I just want to make the point, because of the controversy, the terms of the agreement became public, and they were very benign. There was nothing binding on the Victorian government from the agreement. It was just the paper equivalent of a handshake. Yeah, let's do business, thumbs up, right? What China got out of it was got to list Victoria, the state of Victoria, as one of the jurisdictions participating in the Belt and Road. Victoria actually got a lot out of it. We got a lot of business with China, including industrial business, from that agreement. So there were two agreements that we signed as part of that in that 2017-2018 period. And that's when there was great enthusiasm for the Belt and Road.
Yeah. There are, when it comes to these agreements and secret and confidential and so on and so forth, I mean, the memorandum of understanding between China and any country which joins, it's designed for that country. There's no one standard agreement everybody signs. Yeah. Because you have to think about the conditions, the demands, the aspirations of that country, but there is nothing secret. There is just outlining the principles of cooperation. Now, there are agreements to build railways or highways or ports between companies. Of course, these are confidential. Companies don't reveal. And then that becomes like a way of trying to say, look, they are secretive. There's something strange with this, and so on and so forth. But how did that memorandum of understanding, that cooperation, go later?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. It turns out it wasn't secret because China demanded it. It was secret because the Australian government kept it secret. Well, what happened was there was a sharp turn to hostility from the United States government, especially under the Trump administration. But we documented how it actually began in the last year of the Obama administration, where there were national security statements made by Obama's officials, which were the height of insulting in our view when we look back at it, because they said the greatest security challenge or risk to the United States is no longer ISIS, the terrorist organization. It is now China and Russia, right? And all China was doing was business with the world to that point, and not.
We had the whole under Obama administration. We have the whole pivot to Asia strategy.
Exactly. No, exactly. So Obama set that up, but of course, as we know, we all remember the Trump years. When Trump came along, he came along with some pretty brutal language. Now, that said, I think our government never really understood Trump, but they were very much in collusion, I think, with the worst elements in the Trump administration. People like Peter Navarro and Mike Pompeo and John Bolton, real xenophobes, real China haters, right? And so suddenly there was this intense pressure to demonize everything to do with China, and suddenly the Belt and Road was a threat. Now, we had, Australia was just about to roll out a national broadband network and include the Chinese telecommunications company Huawei in that. And this was the first target. This was targeted to make sure that didn't happen. And with the strategic targeting by the United States and their Australian collaborators, they didn't just demonize Huawei, they demonized the entire Belt and Road, right? And so for all the years starting with the Trump administration, what had been positive up until then suddenly became very negative, right? But even up until mid-2019, in fact, June 2019, so that's 3 years ago, and that was 2 years into Trump's presidency, 2.5 years into Trump's presidency, our Prime Minister then, Scott Morrison, said, we welcome the contribution Belt and Road can make to the region. That's what he said in June 2019. But then when COVID hit and the pandemic started, in those first few months, Trump went from being very complimentary to China to suddenly there was a shift around March, April in the Trump administration because they wanted to deflect from their own failings of handling the pandemic. And suddenly it all became about blaming China for the pandemic, right? And our government got involved in that. And our Prime Minister, who I'm happy to say we've just voted out of office, but the same Scott Morrison, he became very nasty in his language, and he demanded all sorts of things, including an investigation of China, where China was going to have to open up everything to inspectors with the equivalent of weapons inspectors' powers. It's something that he knew a sovereign country like China would never agree to. It was a deliberately crafted insult to China. And there was a rapid deterioration of relationship on the back of that. What I'm getting to specifically the Belt and Road, I want to play another clip now, because it was at this time that Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, made an appearance on Australian television. Now, the channel it was a rather bizarre appearance, because the channel he appeared on is Sky News, and it's a very extreme show. These are political extremists that put up a show. But the subject became Victoria's Belt and Road Agreement. And in that appearance, Mike Pompeo made what amounted to a threat. I just want to play that.
The US Secretary of State has issued a stern warning about any deals done with China under its Belt and Road Initiative. The Victorian government has been criticised for refusing to release federal government advice about the state's contentious economic partnership with China. Secretary Pompeo says he isn't aware of the specific details relating to Victoria's Belt and Road Initiative, but warned the US would be prepared to disconnect if the deal adversely impacted America's national security.
We will not take any risk to our telecommunications infrastructure, any risk to the national security elements of what we need to do with our Five Eyes partners. We're going to protect and preserve the security of those institutions. So I don't know the nature of those projects precisely, but to the extent they have an adverse impact on our ability to protect telecommunications from our private citizens or security networks for our defense and intelligence communities, we will simply disconnect. We will simply separate. We're going to preserve trusted networks for important information. We hope our friends and partners and allies across the world, especially our Five Eyes partners like Australia, will do the same.
That's quite strong.
And you heard him say, we don't know the nature of these agreements, because at that time it hadn't come. When it came out later, it was so benign it wasn't funny. It had nothing to do with telecommunications. Yet on the back of that appearance, our federal government passed a law to override Victoria's agreement, the state agreement, and force it to be torn up, even though it amounted to not very much. But here's the funny thing, Hussein. All the while, the federal government's own agreement with China on the Belt and Road still remains in effect and still remains secret. It was bizarre. It was part of a climate of hysteria that was targeted at China, and frankly, Australia ended up shooting itself in the foot in order just to march in lockstep with the United States demonization of this project.
Yeah, there was maybe it's good that it's still active, that the MOU, the federal government MOU, you had, as you mentioned, there were recent elections. Yes. There was a shifting government from conservative to the Labor. Does that imply in any way a shift in the attitude or just a continuation?
Well, it remains to be seen how it might change. We're all hoping something will change. We're pessimistic that our basic strategic outlook will change, because unfortunately, if you saw the nature of Pompeo's threat there, the Labor Party tends to be fearful of such threats as much as the Conservatives do. So when he was saying, we will cut you off, that was basically the threat. We will cut you off. We have this hang up. If look at that little island beside your shoulder there. This is a hang up we've been playing on. We've played on for 2 centuries, where we have been made to feel afraid in Asia, afraid of our neighborhood. We're a white outpost. This is the worst side of Australia's outlook. We're a white outpost in an Asian neighborhood, and we've been made to feel fearful. And so our 2 strongest alliances are with the United States and the United Kingdom. And look how far away they are from where we actually are. Right? New Zealand is a lot more, independent than we are actually. New Zealand is less inclined. Now, unfortunately, that's changing a bit, but traditionally, New Zealand's less inclined to say, please come and protect us like we are. But that's our attitude. And unfortunately, the Labor Party, I don't think, is going to change that. However, what the Labor Party may do is change the tone of how they engage with China, drop the hysterical war rhetoric that we've had so far. And our Prime Minister, although he made his first visit our new Prime Minister made his first visit to Japan to participate in this Quad dialogue, which is United States, Japan, Australia, and India, which is supposed to be this alliance to contain China in the Indo-Pacific, this ridiculous term, Indo-Pacific. That's what that is about. He took his second trip to Indonesia, and because Indonesia is our closest neighbor, and he wants to establish a much closer relationship with Indonesia, which is good on the face of it. And some of the thinking here is, we need to have a relationship with Indonesia to balance our relationship with China, to be a buffer against China, because it still implies that China is a threat. Yeah, all China is our best customer. It's never been a threat, never likely to be a threat, unless we ask it to be a threat. Like we will have to poke it in the eye to make it a threat, but we're sort of moving in that direction. However, the positive side is the Indonesians have said to us, hey, we deal with China in a different way than you guys. Maybe you should pay attention to what we do, because they do deal with China in a different way, in a much more positive way than we do. And I'm hoping that that may blow back on Australia. What it means for the Belt and Road, I'm not sure, because unfortunately, whereas before this Trump period, the majority of Australians saw China as an economic partner, because of the hysteria and the hype of a threat, the majority of Australians now see China as a threat. And unfortunately, that constrains the new government in what they do. Our party like ours has to be very outspoken in combating the disinformation, to provoke our fellow citizens to see the world for how it really is, right? And see that, no, China is not a threat. China is an economic opportunity.
Yeah, and China is not really demanding that you choose sides.
No.
The Indonesians, the Indians, everyone in Asia is telling the United States and Europe now, don't tell us to choose sides. We don't want to choose sides. We are Asian nations, we are Eurasian nations, and we follow our own interests. And I think it's funny that, I mean, Australia is almost an Asian country. I mean, in the football division, international FIFA division, my home country, Iraq, which is in West Asia, plays off against Australia and New Zealand.
We do. And the best we've done in world football is a few years ago, we won the Asian Cup. Yeah. And we were very, very happy about that, because, sorry to digress, but before we joined the Asian region, we were part of Oceania, and the winner of Oceania always had to play off against one of the lower ranked South American countries.
Yeah.
But they were always so much better than us. Yeah. We never got into the World Cup. When we joined Asia, we could do better.
It might be an advantage. Yes. You mentioned the economic impact and trade in the recent years. I remember, around the time when Pompeo making his threats, and also Australia shifting, as you said, using this nasty language against China. The Chinese imposed certain sanctions on Australian goods. And I remember people here who are anti-China, they said we should go and buy Australian wine, support them against China. Now, I don't know if tiny Sweden can buy all the wine from Australia, but what was the impact in terms of your enormous trade volume with China, and also on farmers, on other traders in Australia?
Yeah, I love the idea that Sweden was going to buy our wine, but Sweden has to understand that the 10 million people in Sweden are not really in the same league as the 1,400 million people in China when it comes to a market. And I read not that long ago, back in the 18th century, British textile manufacturers used to fantasize about what they could do if they could convince the Chinese to change their fashion. So they all sewed an extra 6 inches on length on their garments and bought that material from British textile manufacturers, because that would make them all millionaires. The market is so huge. If only they could talk them into doing just that little much extra. The market's so huge, because this illustrates the fact the Chinese market has been the holy grail for centuries. If you crack the Chinese market, you've got it made, right? Hussein, we cracked the Chinese market. This was a two-way street. We had an incredible mutually beneficial trade relationship with China. And so we had all these different sectors, especially in agriculture, that had made it in the Chinese market, starting with wine, but you also had the exports that were affected by what you've just referred to, these trade sanctions. And they weren't actually sanctions. I'll explain them in a minute, but it was wine, it was wood actually as well. It was coal, it was lobsters, things like this. And the poor old lobster industry, that was terrible, because, they went from being able to get well over $100 per lobster to nothing. Right? Absolutely nothing. And they had places like Tasmania, a little tiny island at the bottom of Australia there, our smallest state. They had a massive lobster trade with China and just stopped overnight. But it wasn't sanctions. What it actually was that the Chinese do have trade standards. But while we were on good terms with them, the various mistakes, slip-ups, etc., could be, they're not overlooked, but could be solved. Right? They'd say, okay, yeah, you know, we'll cut you some slack on this. Oh, the other one was beef. Beef was a very big one. Processed meat already processed in Australian abattoirs. Very, very big market into China. So the Chinese would allow certain labeling mistakes to go through because they were making allowances for us. When the relationship turned sour, when we started calling them all sorts of names, and it wasn't just COVID, it was everything else laid on it. It was, in our common language, Hussein, we started talking about the Chinese as if they were worse than the Nazis. And in fact, leading members of parliament compared them to the Nazis, leading members of parliament in the government. This was calculated to be the maximum insult. And the Chinese only took it to a certain level. But when they were accused of being worse than the Nazis, you know, live organ harvesting, mass concentration camp for the Uyghurs. And I don't know if it was 1 million Uyghurs or 3 million Uyghurs or 5 million Uyghurs or 9 million Uyghurs. They could never get the story straight, but what didn't matter, just throw a number out there. This is what the terrible Chinese were doing. At a certain point, the Chinese said, well, okay, you don't want to do business with us. You want to treat us like this, but you do want our money, but okay, we're not going to make allowances for you anymore. And so trade restrictions that had been in the works for a while, they suddenly slapped them on. And for those sectors, it was brutal, absolutely brutal. Whole sectors went on to their knees because of these sanctions. But the funny thing was, who stepped in to the Chinese market and started providing those same goods? Our American allies. Our American allies were saying to us, Australia, we've got you back, Australia. You stand up for yourself, Australia. We've got you. We're right there with you. Hey, China, come and buy our lobster. Come and buy our meat. Come and buy our coal. Right? And the Americans literally stepped in and started selling all those goods while patting us on the back.
First year of US-Chinese relations, the COVID year, 2020, actually trade between US and China increased.
Yes.
Higher than ever before. And it's still increasing.
But you know what also? Trade with China and Australia also increased. But mainly because of their dependence on iron ore.
Okay.
So there's one commodity that we've got, right, that they need at the moment, and they need it from us, and that's iron ore. And they will still do business with us for that iron ore. However, they are working hard to develop iron ore, a trade relationship with Africa for iron ore, right, and with Brazil. And if they get those up and going, and they have a better relationship with Brazil, Australia better, and Africa, Australia better watch itself, because China just might turn around one day and turn off that tap and say, we're not interested in your iron ore either. And none of this is necessary. None of this is necessary. These were hard-won markets that our government should have been standing up for our exporters. Instead, they were standing up for United States foreign policy. And they've been gutted. So our party is just trying to fight very hard to get people to see this for what it was, so they realize how ridiculous it is, and we get back to having an independent outlook. And once we act independently, I'm sure the Chinese would be prepared to do business. In fact, the Chinese premier, as soon as Albanese, our new prime minister, won the election, reached out to him to have an overture and say, you know, let's reset the relationship. Unfortunately, the new prime minister hasn't accepted that invitation yet.
Yeah, I mean, there's enormous pressure, of course, given the tense situation in the world. But I mean, we are moving towards a positive direction in the discussion, and also what we consider to be an ideal situation for nations. As you said, if Australia is independent and can deal with China independently. I mean, China is not demanding that you become a lackey of China or a follower of China. That's not the idea. But in a positive sense, in an ideal situation, what are the kinds of projects your party is proposing to build in Australia in collaboration with China, or as an effect of the Belt and collaboration with China and the Belt and Road? That's one part. Then you have the region around you where there's enormous need for development.
Yeah.
Also, how can, as you mentioned in the memorandum of understanding, was actually working with China in third countries. And what is Australia's role then in developing the global economy, especially eliminating poverty from large parts of Asia and Africa? So there are these three areas in Australia itself, around Australia, but also internationally.
Well, if you have a look at that map to your right there of Australia, what you'll see is those lines are proposed high-speed railway lines. And Australia is a country that
By the way, we borrowed these maps from the Schiller Institute, which you had worked to develop them. So
that is the proposal for high-speed rail in Australia. Now, we don't have any of that at the moment. What we have is 25 million people on a land area that's, roughly the size of the lower 48 states of the United States, right? So, but just 25 million people. Now, a big chunk of it in the middle is desert, but there's a lot of land and there's a lot of potential if it can be developed. But that development requires transportation infrastructure and it requires water, right? Now, once upon a time, especially in the years after World War II, our country had a lot of momentum with its own internal development, and we did spectacular things. We've lost that in recent times. And in fact, the most viable initial part of that high-speed rail proposal is just from the bottom point there where Melbourne is, where I am now, to Brisbane. That would go from Melbourne to Sydney, the biggest city, and to Brisbane. All right, so here's Melbourne, and here is Brisbane. So there's the most likely first route of a high-speed railway line in Australia would be connecting Melbourne to Sydney to Brisbane. So forget this particular route here. I'm just pointing out there's Sydney, there's Brisbane. But to give you a sense of how Australia's expectations have fallen, the last time this was looked at, and there was an inquiry into whether it's viable or not. They concluded it was viable, but it would take 50 years to build that. That's what they concluded in 2013. It would take 50 years to build this project, 5 decades. And we said at the time, this is ridiculous. We should invite the Chinese in to build it for us, right? Because clearly they have capacities from their own economic development that we could learn from. If we think that it'll take a project like that would take us 50 years, which is about 2,000 kilometers of railway line, right? If that would take us 50 years, maybe we should learn from the Chinese and we could benefit from the Belt and Road in that way, right? Look, they are practiced at the moment at intense economic development. We seem to have lost our ability to do that. That clip I played you earlier of that trade minister saying, we're good at infrastructure. What he's talking about, mainly in his mind, was inner city projects like, tunnels to help alleviate transportation congestion that they could whack tolls on. So toll roads, right? And yeah, they're good. We're good at that in Australia. But visionary nation building projects like the Chinese routinely do, we seem to have forgotten. So if a Belt and Road collaboration allows us to actually be a little bit humble and say, hey, China, we want to learn from you how to do this, then we have the potential to open up the whole country with that approach. So this is a variation of what's on your map there. With there's another railway line that actually exists across here, but it's not.
The reason why it's on the coast is that where the population is, isn't it?
Yeah, this right here, this part in the middle, this is desert. Now, that said, every now and then it rains in that desert, and when it rains, it comes alive. It's teeming with life, but it doesn't rain very often. But what we need to do here is build all sorts of, there's a potential for all sorts of projects. And I've got some of the, this will give you a sense of what I'm talking about. Here's the desert area of Australia. This is the rainfall map of Australia, Hussein. And you can see the rainfall is all around there. But this rainfall up here, that is as heavy a rainfall as exists anywhere in the world. Right? And so we produced this map years ago. And this is the population density. You can see how it maps the rainfall, right? But that's a tiny population density. And so years ago, we produced this graphic to show 18 major water projects that could be built where you take some of these high rainfall areas here, capture some of the water. You don't have to capture all of it. There's a mountain range all along the coast here, and what that mountain range does, it means the ocean water comes in, the ocean evaporation is blown into land. The oceans push it up, it cools down, and it rains, and it runs back out to sea again.
It runs off.
If you could, and hardly any of it gets inland. The stuff that happens inland, this area here is this shaded area here is called the Murray-Darling Basin. This gets about 6% of Australia's water runoff, but with that 6% of water runoff, we produce 80% of our agricultural output because it's the most developed part of Australia. If we could just capture some of that here, there's very fertile lands here and in places like Western Australia and the Northern Territory. We already, with the population of 25 million, we already produce enough food for about 60 million, most of which we export. We could produce food for so much more, right, if we could capture the water. But it's not just the water. You need the high-speed rail to get through these long distances, because at the moment we're subjected to what this map showed, this particular graphic here. This is a bit blurry, but it's called tyranny of distance crops. We have to produce grains, grazing, canned and dried fruit because it takes so long to get to market, but it's less profitable. If we had water, and transportation, you can get it to market. We can produce much more higher value goods. And then look at this particular graphic here, which we produced at the time as well. This is an idea that if we could have a high-speed transportation system to get from Melbourne to Darwin in 24 hours, that's what the technology would allow us to do, where you are picking up goods, fruit, product along the way. You could get that with high-speed shipping into the biggest ports in the world, in Indonesia, in Southeast Asia there, in Japan, in China, within 48 to 72 hours, right? And Australia could be supplying all that up into the most densely populated part of the planet. And it would be a wonderful win-win relationship that we would have. There's actually, we have developed some of the best high-speed shipping technology here in Australia. So these particular ships, that they're not huge ships, but the point is you could run lots of them. I mean, they have the record for crossing the Pacific Ocean and crossing the Atlantic Ocean. These high-speed catamarans. These are Australian designs, and you could be doing so much with this food production into these centres, these population centres that are crying out for this kind of product. Because Australia is clean and green and all those sort of things that are good about us. That's the potential. And then with that potential, we would be, you don't just limit it to the other crops we could grow, that we can still have trade relationships branched out to Africa and South America, et cetera, helping to, feed the world, raise living standards. With our skills back as an economic development nation, we could be really contributing to Belt and Road projects around the world, right? Showing people what we do here, because there are certain challenges that we have to overcome in Australia that are different than the challenges they've had to overcome in China. but that would be similar to some of the challenges they have to overcome in Africa, right? These arid, the arid parts of Africa. And in fact, as you know, you're one of the experts in the Lake Chad project, right? And the Lake Chad project is very similar in reverse to what we call our Bradfield scheme, which is get the water from this area here and get it down to this really dry area here, right? And turn this whole area into a food bowl. So, you know, and we could contribute that kind of knowledge to Africa.
Yeah, there are similar problems. I mean, the Lake Chad project is to take some water from the Congo River down to Chad and refill the Lake Chad, which is a huge ecological disaster. I mean, you have the Chinese build the south-north water transfer system, which transfers as much water as the Nile River does every year. So you can put together the knowledge you have, the knowledge and technology the Chinese have, and work together in other parts of the world to alleviate poverty and bring economic development. I think we can stop the sharing. Okay, no, I think with this said, I mean, there is much more. You have so much knowledge of these things, but I think it has been a wonderful talking to you and get the background to this development in Australia. As I said in the beginning, you know, for people, they don't really understand Australian situation and Australian politics. They think that Australia is part of the Atlantic region rather than being an Asian nation. But also the knowledge about Australia is very limited. We have a lot in the media about food, about tourism, about this and that, Aborigine, you know, culture and so on. But we have absolutely no idea about the economics of Australia and its relationship to the world, not only China. But this was a very, very informative discussion. And I thank you very much for taking the time to be with us.
Thanks for the invitation, Hussein. It's been good.